Assalamu Alaikum. It's amazing to see how many people today. I'll get straight to introducing our guest speaker today. So Harris Irfan has 27 years of experience banking, including being the co-founder of Deutsche Bank's world-leading Islamic finance division, as well as the former global head of Islamic finance at Barclays. Currently, he is the CFO at Gateway Global and the director of the UK Islamic FinTech panel. He's also the founder and managing director of Cordoba Capital, which is an Islamic finance and FinTech consultancy firm. Because of, alhamdulillah, all of these achievements, he is now ranked as one of the top 100 Bain UK leaders in tech, according to the Financial Times. Without further ado, I'll leave it to you.
Thank you. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulil Kareem. Assalamu Alaikum. Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much to ISOP for inviting me. I usually deliver a variant of this lecture to 3 different types of groups. One is teenagers, one is bankers and practitioners, and the third one is people like you, university students. And my aim here is to try and answer 3 questions, which I think you saw on your flyer. And those questions are: what's wrong with our current monetary system? Does Islam offer a socially just economic solution? And is Bitcoin the future of Islamic and ethical finance? So I remember when I ran an Islamic society at university, we invited an Islamic bank, going back quite a long way now. We invited an Islamic bank in the UK to talk to us about this. And these bankers wore sharp suits and spoke jargon, and I honestly had no clue what they were talking about. They had an opportunity to explain to young people who might be able to create a difference in the world what it meant to have a just, holistic, sustainable, and ethical financial system. Instead, what they gave us was just, frankly, a lot of buzzwords and jargon. And I was a physics undergraduate. I had honestly no understanding of economics, of finance, of management, of business. This was completely alien subjects to me. So really, I was none the wiser after that event. We also invited a lady from the Murabitun, which is, some of you may be aware of a Muslim group who believe in setting up a gold standard. That's something that I'm going to come on to a little bit later. And again, you know, the importance of having a single sound monetary system and its effect on the world, the effect on social justice and harmony, on peace and stability, on scientific and cultural progress is so immense. And yet both of these groups, the Islamic bankers who talked to us and the Murabitun who spoke to us about the gold standard, didn't explain to us in a language that we understood why Islam potentially offers a solution to economic inequality, to poverty, to many other problems that we have in society today. Healthcare, the pandemic, climate change even. What if there was a way of fixing all these problems in one, I wouldn't say easy, but one, I think, simple to understand way? So if by the end of this session today, I haven't explained it to you in a way that you've understood, then I've failed. And please use the Q&A to make sure that I explain things to you. So in this discussion, I want us to think about something beyond the boring technicalities of finance or economics. These are not things only reserved for bankers and economists. Later on, I'm going to use the term priests speaking Latin. The bankers and economists have deliberately set up a system to obfuscate, to make things seem difficult to understand for the layperson, but it's actually really, really easy. And I'm assuming that most people here are not economists. Is that correct? Most of you are studying social sciences and so on. So I imagine only a small number of you are. So to the extent that I can, I'll try and avoid using certain words, but I'm going to define certain words as we talk. Right. Our economy is broken. That much is self-evident. I think we should hopefully all agree that there's a problem today. We have huge inequality. What is it about the Islamic economic model that is fairer and more just? So let's start by talking about the history of debt. What is money? Okay. When I ask this question, I don't want to ask just orthodox economists. And unfortunately, for those of you studying economics here, those are the people who will be taught by orthodox economists. I also want to talk to heterodox, and I want to talk to anthropologists. And they have slightly different view. Money should be just a medium of exchange. It has no value by itself. It's used to measure value in other things, in the real economy, in real goods and services. It's not a commodity to be traded. And that's really, really important, this concept of real economy. So if we listen to somebody like David Graeber, for example, who wrote a book called Debt: The First 5,000 Years. And by the way, bear in mind that whenever I mention people who's thinking, who have done some thinking along economic lines, I don't necessarily always agree with them. They may have different political views from me. They may have different economic views from me. But sometimes they say intelligent things, and I think it's important, even if we have a very strong view for or against Bitcoin, for example, that we consider everybody's views and attempt to, I think it's always good to find overlapping areas, because that means that whatever we have today can be made better. And Islam did that itself. The Islamic Golden Age was a function of borrowing from and improving the science, the technology, the culture of neighboring civilizations, as long as it didn't compromise the core values of Islam. So, I mean, I extensively quote David Graeber. I think that he was a very smart man. I didn't agree with all of his views, but he contends that before money, there was debt. Many economists will say that money begins as barter, and I think that's true in a very, very specific instance. I think generally speaking, a barter system would very quickly move to an IOU system. So for example, 5,000 years ago, agrarian societies had elaborate systems to buy and sell on credit, since no coinage had been invented. So what they do is, for example, a farmer buys clothes from a merchant, let's say, with an IOU. He says, my harvest is not ready, but it will be ready. Here's an IOU something for these clothes. Now, let's say the merchant then goes on to pay, I don't know, a carpenter to fix his door. But he has an IOU, and the farmer's standing is strong in the community. So that IOU circulates in the community as long as we believe that the credit is good. The IOU is taken on faith. And that's where we get the word credit from, credere, meaning to believe. So money originates as debt. That's one contention. Now, when a community becomes large and powerful enough, it can enslave and conquer neighboring peoples. So human beings are reduced to inventory or material commodities to be traded. And as we know, early civilizations held commodities and surplus commodities in what we call temples, but they're really industrial concerns. So the priests who run these temples lend commodities to merchants. It's very difficult to audit the P&L of giving commodities for merchants who then go on to trade them. So what you do is you charge them interest. That's much easier. Here's some commodities. I'll charge you, say, a 10% rate of return on those commodities. Now, merchants lend on to others. And so interest proliferates in society. So when you have so much credit and so much interest circulating, you need to be able to enforce it. So you have to demand collateral. And collateral could be commodities, could be grains, could be livestock. But what if you still can't afford to repay your loan? Then you offer up your own family, your children, your wife. They become debt peons. And debt peonage gets passed down through the generations. So owning a human being becomes debt's worst manifestation. And slaves are now no longer just war booty, they're anyone. So debt leads to slavery, historically. And of course, violent coercion is your primary enforcement mechanism. So that's to ensure that debt is passed down from generation to generation. So that's why in history, we've seen rulers and governments wipe the slate clean. And we even see this in the Bible, the 5th century BC, the law of Jubilee, the governor of Judea instituted a law of Jubilee, which wiped the slate clean every Sabbath year, every 7th year. Debt peons were returned to their families, otherwise you'd have a rebellion on your hands. So we found that religion outlawed interest for the sake of fairness and equality. One of the quotes I like to give to the bankers and practitioners, because they're not always Muslim, and ironically in the Islamic finance community, it seems to be but it's not very helpful even sometimes to be Muslim in Islamic banking. So I often take a quote from the Bible. And that is from, those of you who want to check the quote, is John 2:13 and Matthew 21:13. It's when Jesus is in the temple of Herod during the Passover, and he enters the temple of Herod. And the quote is, and making a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables and the seats of them that sold doves. And he told those that sold the pigeons, take these things away and do not make God's house a house of trade. This house shall be called a house of prayer, but you make it a den of robbers. That's a sentiment that is passed to Islam. Classic theologians have said, for example, Imam al-Ghazali has said, it becomes easier for the financier to earn more money on the basis of interest without bothering himself to take pains in real economic activities. It's the idea of the real economy. The interests of humanity cannot be safeguarded without real trade skills, industry, and construction. Allah created dirhams and dinars so that they may be circulated between hands and act as a fair judge between different commodities and work as a medium to acquire other things. This idea of money as a medium of exchange, not a commodity to be traded. So let's ask the question, what is riba? There's a unanimous orthodox opinion on this. So I know that there are some fringe people who think that riba is excessive interest, but that's not the orthodox opinion. It is an increment. It's any excess on a principal amount of money. So it could be 1 cent on $1 million. That's riba. And it's very clear in Islam. We don't say a little bit of alcohol is okay. So why is it that we've normalized that a little bit of interest is okay? It seems to be normalized. I mean, we all have normal bank accounts, you know, we take out mortgages and car loans and student loans even. I mean, you know, we're all tainted by this and sometimes we feel we have no option. Otherwise, how would we study? So all of our lives are tainted by riba. And it's been normalized. But unfortunately, it's one of the 7 most heinous sins. It ranks alongside shirk and the taking of life. That's how serious it is. So we know in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 275, Allah has permitted trade and forbidden interest. And he has declared war against those who deal with riba. This is very clear to us. And yet we still do it. So why is it wrong? It's wrong because I can make money out of money. What does that mean? It means if I'm rich, I can get richer. But if I'm poor, I get poorer. And I'll explain in detail why poor get poorer, because it's related to purchasing power. There's also another term that I'm going to come to use later on, which is fractional reserve banking. So I just want you to remember that phrase, because it's something that I'm going to pick up on a little bit later and explain why it's such a problem in today's society. And the issue behind it is the modern banking system allows money to be created from thin air. This is what I refer to as the magic money tree. So I usually ask this question to teenagers, but maybe you guys can answer it. Does anyone know what the left picture is? Just shout it out if you know what it is. It's the lady from the Great Depression. Correct, exactly. This is 1936. This lady's only 32 years old. You know, she looks a lot older than that. She's got 7 children, and she's destitute by the side of the road. She's a California pea picker. And of course, the Great Depression has, left her by the side of the road. That's, I think, is a very multi-layered picture. It says so much about what was happening at that time. And the novels of that time reflect that as well. Picture in the middle, anyone recognize it? Shout out, come on, you're nodding your head.
The scavenger waiting for the child in Sudan.
I didn't quite hear, but I'm going to guess you might have said Kevin Carter in that, did you?
No, but
South African photographer who, no, maybe not. So this is 93, I think. This is a child in South Sudan on the way to a feeding station. And of course, you know, Kevin Carter, a South African photographer, has taken a picture of this. A vulture lands nearby, the child is near to death. I'm happy to say, by the way, the child didn't make it to the feeding station. But here's the thing, the photographers were told not to interfere. Can you imagine what kind of a world we live in? I think there was some reason around disease or, I don't know, infectious something, I don't know what. But they were told not to interfere. Now, Kevin Carter obviously suffered from some mental health problems as well. But 4 months after taking this photograph, he was so racked with guilt that he committed suicide. And he won a Pulitzer Prize for this. This, I'm sure, will all be familiar to you, Grenfell Tower. 72 people lost their lives because the developers didn't want to spend £2 extra per panel on a fireproof cladding. So that's the face of modern capitalism. Now, I'm a capitalist. I'm a former investment banker. I work in that system, but I believe capitalism is something else, and I believe it's defined by my faith. People say, is Islam socialist or is it capitalist? It's neither. It's something unique. But if you were to ask me, what's my view on free markets and so on, I'm a capitalist. This is not capitalism. This is vulture capitalism. Oh yes. Very importantly, in 2014, now, do we think our politicians can find a solution to inequality? Hands up, who thinks politicians can find a solution to inequality, economic inequality? 0 hands are going up. Who thinks they can't? I think they can't. Most people agree. In 2014, the House of Commons had a debate where they debated money creation, and it's the first time they had that debate in 170 years. And only 30 MPs attended that debate. Around the same time, they had a debate about their own expenses, and over 600 MPs turned up. So you know where their priorities lie. Also around the same time, a poll was conducted of MPs, and the results of the poll were very instructive. 71% of all MPs believe only government has the power to create money. In fact, as we're about to learn, and hopefully I'll explain to you, 97% of all money in the UK economy is created by private sector banks, who are given the legal right to create money through the act of credit creation or lending. That's how money is created, not by governments. Tale of the Mexican fisherman. Who knows this story, by the way? Anyone? It's sometimes told in different, good, not, most of you don't, that's great, because often people in the audience are aware of this. Anyway, here's the story. It's by a German author called Heinrich Boll, sometimes set in different locations and different settings. My version is this: an American businessman stands at the pier of a picturesque coastal Mexican village when a small boat docks. And the lone fisherman steps out with his catch for the day, which is several large yellowfin tuna. The American compliments the Mexican fisherman on the quality of the fish. He says, "How long did it take you to catch them?" And the fisherman says, "Only a short while." Why not stay out and catch some more? "I have enough to support my family's needs," said the fisherman. "Well, what will you do with the rest of your time?" "Well, I sleep a little, I fish a little, I play with my children, I take a siesta with the wife, and in the evening, I stroll into the village, I sip wine, and I sing songs with my friends." So the American scoffs. He says, "I have a Harvard MBA, sorry, I was an LSE MBA. I have an LSE MBA, and I work as a management consultant from McKinsey, and I can help you." "How, senor?" says the fisherman, taken aback. "Well, you spend more time fishing. With the proceeds, you buy a bigger boat. And with the catch from the bigger boat, you could buy several boats. And eventually, you have a fleet. Instead of selling your catch to a middleman, you have the power to sell directly to the customer, eventually opening your own canning factory. You control the product, the processing, the distribution. You can leave this small coastal village and move to Mexico City. And after that, Los Angeles. And then eventually, New York, where you would run your expanding enterprise." "How long would that take?" says the fisherman. "Oh, maybe 15, 20 years. And after that," now this is where it gets really interesting, says the management consultant with the MBA from LSE. He says, "When the time is right, you announce an initial public offering, an IPO, and you sell your company's shares to the public. You'll be rich, a millionaire." "Millions, senor. Then what?" "You retire. You can move to a beautiful coastal village where you'd sleep late, catch a little fish, play with your children, take a siesta, and then in the evening you stroll into the village and enjoy drinks and songs with your friends." So the moral is obvious, right? It's a corny story, but the moral is obvious. We live in a world that's defined by GDP, gross domestic product. It's a nonsense metric for human progress. It measures the exchange value of goods, not the experiential value of the world that we live in. It doesn't measure literacy. It doesn't measure mental health, divorce rates, suicide rates, environmental pollution. And that's why it's a deeply flawed metric of human progress. So how do we fix a broken economy? Well, later on, I'm going to talk about the concept of a sound money. So we're going to keep using this term sound money. I'm going to come back to it and I'm going to define it. So I'm going to keep that idea in your head. And that's when I'm also going to talk about fiat money. What is fiat money? Fiat is by decree. Fiat money is money that has been decreed to be legal tender by a ruler or a state. So US dollar is fiat, pound sterling is fiat, the yen, the euro, all these global currencies are fiat currencies. And I'm going to explain why they're unsound and why they're bad for human progress, why they're bad for environmental stability, and why they're bad for peace between nations. So I want to introduce the concept of exchange value versus experiential value. That, of course, the picture is Mecca, right? What do we see? We see the clock tower and the Abrajal Bayt, 7 towers. So right in the middle here is a tiny little black dot, which is the Kaaba, which we don't see anymore. Anytime someone now publishes a picture of Mecca, what they see is this huge monstrosity in the middle, right? That's what Mecca has become. So this is what the unbridled pursuit of profit has led to. This is what happens when you measure GDP as a measure of human progress. What we've done is we've destroyed history. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. Another example I use is by a Greek economist called Yanis Varoufakis. Again, please bear in mind that I don't necessarily agree with the political and economic views of everybody that I quote, but I find them useful. In fact, Yanis Varoufakis wrote a very good book, red cover, hardback. Please get it. It's called something like Talking to My Daughter About the Economy. And I literally used it to explain the economy to my daughter. So it's a really great book, very readable. Varoufakis talks about the example of a forest fire. What happens in a forest fire? You actually raise GDP because your exchange value goes up. You use fuel. You have firemen's wages to pay. You use equipment. You use transport to put out the fire. But of course, the forest fire has reduced experiential value. You don't have a forest anymore. You've reduced environmental value. But a forest fire is good for the economy. It's nuts, right? Similarly, those of you studying economics may have come across something called the discounted cash flow methodology. This is a methodology that corporate financiers use to measure the value of a project or an asset. And the way it measures the value of the project, it says cash flows that occur in the future are worth less than cash flows that occur now. So what it does is it leads to, for example, agricultural desertification, because farmers are incentivized economically to overtill the land, overuse the land until it's barren and destroyed. So the methods that modern economics uses to measure human progress are actually bad for human progress. By the way, the example of desertification is an example used by another author I recommend to you, is Tariq al-Diwani, who wrote a book called The Problem with Interest. And that's a very good primer on the problem with interest, as the name suggests. So this is how modern economics or neoclassical economics is taught. It is not based in reality. It constructs false models. And again, I use the term priest speaking Latin. So of course, in the Middle Ages, Latin was a means for the priests to be the gatekeepers to God. So God's word is written in Latin. The lay people don't need to understand this. So let me explain to you what God is saying. Of course, we don't believe that. We believe we have a direct line to God. We can communicate with him directly 5 times a day or any time that we want. We don't have to speak another language to do it, right? So these economists are the priests speaking Latin. Now, there's another author I recommend to you, Saifuddin Ammous, who wrote a book called The Bitcoin Standard. Really, really good summary introduction to Bitcoin. And he contends that there is such a thing as the fiat business model. And it goes like this. Number 1, find anything to sell, any asset, even at, or preferably at, a loss. Number 2, borrow money from the US Fed or a central bank at a tiny interest rate, like 2%. Number 3, give a credit card to customers at 20%. Number 4, people are now in debt for stupid things that they don't need, but it's okay because money loses value anyway, it's inflated away. So if you have $100 in your account at the beginning of the 20th century, by the end of the 20th century, it's only worth $4. You have 96% devaluation of the US dollar in real terms. Number 5, as a result of this ridiculous system, GDP number goes up, right? What has happened is that empirical and statistical analysis of economic history has been excluded from the university curriculum. By the way, I could be thrown out for saying this within these hallowed grounds, because this is the center of neoclassical economics, right? So all of that has been excluded from the economic syllabus. So economic reality is not part of it. There's been a lobbying by big business that has led to a selective amnesia where great swathes of economic history have been ignored due to the business interests of big corporates. And they are the people who fund MBA schools and economic departments. So it's in their interest to propagate a dogma that celebrates them but doesn't criticize them. And we sometimes refer to this as the Chicago School of Economics. It advocates the financialization of the economy. That means more debt, more financial services. So what it leads to is a market society. And a market society is a joyless place. It's a joyless place that measures exchange value, this GDP number I'm talking to you about, over experiential value, the use of a forest, right? Oh, by the way, sometimes I often say to people, there's no clearer demonstration to me of the lack of innovation and inventiveness of a society that is caused by the need for GDP number to go up than the creation of the vacuous culture of TikTok houses and pop culture influences. This I think is a sort of a collective stupidity in society that is encouraged by the lack of a sound monetary base. And I really, really strongly believe that the two are connected. And I'll speak a little bit more about that later. Right. You know what the picture on the left is. What's the picture on the right? Yeah, it's the Tower of Sauron, right? It's actually really incredible how similar the two are. So anyway, I have a confession. When I was a junior banker, I actually financed the construction of that tower. And extremely naively, not realizing I was participating in the wholesale destruction of our own heritage. The hills around Makkah were detonated into a billion pebbles. Historic forts, historic buildings were torn down to make way for this monstrous 7-tower construction. And this is an example of dragging a city into the modern era. In reality, it's actually an example of extreme vandalism. And this is what modern notions of financial success have led to. Right. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit of a potted history of Islamic finance, and hopefully that will lead us into Bitcoin. I was a junior banker in the year 2001, and I was placed by Deutsche Bank in Dubai in what was to become the Dubai International Financial Center. And my job was to open the office up and originate new corporate finance business. And what happened was a lot of clients came to us and said, well, it's wonderful that you're here in the Middle East, Deutsche Bank, but can you do these deals on a Sharia-compliant basis? And being investment bankers who are blaggers by nature, we said, yeah, sure, we know how to do that. What we actually ended up doing was learning at the feet of some of the world's great scholars in this subject. Now, there was a sort of serendipity at play, I think. We had a lot of a confluence of factors that meant we collected some really talented people in one place, and that network effect was enough to essentially create a revolution in Islamic finance. It was possible at that time to have technically excellent Muslims, ideologically aligned, doing extraordinary things, and being highly profitable, and creating product that people actually wanted. Islamic finance to us was an ideal that we tried to actualize. We knew that there was an Islamic economic model. We knew the justice behind that, and we wanted to replicate that using the financial institutions that we were working with. And we wanted to produce products that were risk sharing, that were real economy, that were asset backed, all the things we talk about in Islamic finance. And I've written about this in some detail in my book. It's the narrative of the story of how this all came about. But what was very important was that we also created our own Manhattan Project. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Manhattan Project. During World War II, the Allies assembled in the Los Alamos Desert. The great scientific minds of the Allies attempted to create the atomic bomb before Hitler, and that was called the Manhattan Project. And something very similar. We created a black box to replicate the return on any financial instrument. Any financial instrument. We could have taken credit default swaps on pork belly futures. I don't expect you to know what that means. It's just the most haram thing you could think of. We could have taken the returns from that and made it Sharia compliant using this black box technology. That's how advanced it was. So it was like splitting the atom, and it could be used for good and it could be used for bad. And guess what? Investment bankers use it for bad, because most of investment banking is a socially useless activity that is designed to make bankers rich. So we ended up destroying the market for Islamic finance, destroying the market particularly for structured investment products, which is a particular type of very complex financial instrument. My boss at the time said, we create conservative products for conservative investors and aggressive products for aggressive investors, which is pretty much the worst thing you can say to Muslims, right? You're telling them, we don't care about ethics. Whatever you want, guys, we'll go fatwa shopping for you. Like, we'll find the scholar who'll say yes to it. That's what they said, right? And this, of course, created a big spat in the industry. A very famous scholar called Sheikh Yusuf Lorenzo described it as the doomsday fatwa. And he said that this was a huge problem, and he was right. We had ended up following the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law. So we had, we could do, as I said, we could create all kinds of crazy instruments. And for example, you could create, and I use this term credit default swap, it's like an insurance policy. So you can take an insurance policy on a certain type of risk. So you could say, I want to insure myself against Greek sovereign default, right? You take CDS on Greek debt. It's a bit like saying to an arsonist, I will sell you an insurance policy on your neighbor's house, right? Obviously, you can't do that. The insurance industry won't allow you to do that. That's illegal. Because if you don't have an interest in something, you can't insure it, because then you're incentivized to set fire to your neighbor's house and collect the winnings. So this was what actually we ended up doing. There is a parallel in, I'm going to loosely call it Christian finance, but it's not really Christian finance. In the Middle Ages, of course, the church banned usury. From the very beginning, the church has banned usury, right? But financiers who wanted to circumvent church law invented a very clever technique called contractum trinius, meaning 3 contracts in one. So individually, each contract was compliant with church law. When you add them up, it was a loan with interest. And the church said, well, it kind of looks okay to me because each contract is okay. They didn't look at the whole picture. That's what's happening in Islamic finance today. And you may have heard of terms like tawarruq or commodity murabaha, which is the dominant financing structure that Islamic banks use today. And unfortunately, these are a synthetic replication of a loan with interest. So it has become our contractum trinius. And now I feel, therefore, despite the advances that we initially made at Deutsche Bank, I feel that Islamic banks are not the future of Islamic finance or the Islamic economic model. I have a quote there about Goldman Sachs. It's a journalist for Rolling Stone magazine who very famously wrote a few years ago, the world's most powerful investment bank, reading Goldman Sachs, is a great vampire squid wrapped around the face of humanity, relentlessly jamming its blood funnel into anything that smells like money. It's just a fantastic quote. I was approached by Goldman Sachs in 2011. They wanted to issue a sukuk. A sukuk is a type of Islamic bond. It doesn't matter exactly how it works. Basically, it's a Sharia-compliant version of a coupon-generating instrument that you list on an exchange somewhere. They smelt money in Islamic finance, and they said, we want to issue a $2 billion Islamic bond. And we want to use this type of structure, and they came to my consulting firm. And I said, well, it's great that you're thinking of doing this, but why do you want to use this structure? It's very, very problematic. Here are some real economy ways that we can structure an Islamic instrument for you. And they said, no. Our credit traders understand this because it looks and feels like a loan with interest. Our compliance people understand it. Our legal people understand it. Our whole bank understands it. We just want to go with this because it looks and feels like a conventional loan. I said, that's exactly the problem. Anyway, they went ahead and did it. And, surprise, surprise, it's the only high-profile failure of an Islamic bond ever. 2 years later, they came back to the market and they did it again with the structure that I somewhat tweaked, for which had originally been suggested to them. The Sharia advisory firm, I said to them, by the way, I'm sorry, I can't advise you on this because it's going to go wrong. And the Sharia advisory firm that did advise them on this closed down very shortly thereafter. So let's talk about the UK Islamic banks. And I'm going slightly off on a tangent. And I know you guys are here to talk about Bitcoin, and I'm definitely going to come to it, but it's important background. And we have a problem here in the UK. The CEOs of the British Islamic banks are non-Muslim, middle-aged men, all of them, every single one, right? They generally don't buy Sharia-compliant products for their own personal portfolios. They hire and promote people who are made in their own mold. Say this, they're openly Islamophobic. I'm not going to say too much, but if you Google the words Gatehouse Bank Employment Tribunal, you'll see exactly what I mean and the kind of people that we're dealing with here. I have been at a corporate function of an Islamic bank where alcohol was served. That's alcohol that's paid by the shareholders of that bank. I think shareholders, particularly Gulf shareholders who buy a bank in London and make it Sharia compliant, have a white savior complex. I don't think, I know they do have that complex. And it's the only reason that explains why British Islamic banks have cumulatively made a loss of £200 million at a time when the conventional banking industry is minting money. And these guys have a monopoly position. There's only one player in the market if you want retail Islamic banking in the UK. How is it possible that collectively they lost £200 million? There are very few women. There are very few under 45. There are almost no practicing Muslims at senior levels. Youngsters of Pakistani and Bangladeshi origin are typically the IT contractors, not senior management. Ownership and management of Islamic banks needed to be in the hands of those who cared about it and are themselves customers. We are not represented in the British Islamic banking industry, except at junior levels. And as a result, there's a lack of engagement with government on issues that matter to us, like student loans. So I hope you've all been following the progress that the Muslim census had on the student loan issue. Muslim census has been trying to get the government to refocus on this promise they made to us almost 10 years ago that they would look at Sharia compliant student loans. They still haven't done it. And I don't think this administration will, because I don't think they like us. It's that simple. So these are important issues that the government won't focus on because the people who run our Islamic banks, our Islamic financial institutions, are not engaged, not culturally attuned to what we need. So this industry is general managers leading managers, not experts leading experts. Because the hallmark of a great company is experts leading experts. That's how Apple was formed. That's how Honda was formed, Porsche, Microsoft. These companies were founded by experts in their field and they're run by experts. What we do in our industry is we take general managers and we assume, hey, you manage people, it'll all be fine. But if they don't know how the product is built and they don't buy the product themselves, if they're not engineers, they're not producing anything useful. A friend of mine who is the CEO of an Islamic fintech firm said to me something very interesting. He said, if I was an alien who landed on planet Earth and looked at the British Islamic banks, I would conclude that it was a huge political money laundering operation. Why else would you hire people who are not credible, don't have the right skill set, have made so many losses, and still persist in rotating these dinosaurs in the same positions? It's almost like a deliberate attempt to lose money, right? So he concluded it was political money laundering, like an offsets program. There was a rare exception, Al Rayan Bank, recently. Unfortunately, he's no longer there. So we have got the same, more of the same. So as a result, the penetration rate for UK Islamic banks is only 2% of British Muslim households, despite a monopoly position. Right? You would think they would come to it. We know that the sin of riba is heinous. We know that it ranks amongst the 7 most deadly sins. And yet we still do it. We still go to our high street banks. We still have normal mortgages. And you know what? I'm not going to tax student loans because there's no option. There's no alternative. Right? And actually, I'm going to talk about this later if we like. There's actually a conservative view that the current incarnation of the student loan is in fact not riba. But that's something we can talk about separately. But this is a real problem because Muslims don't trust Islamic banks, and that's why they're not engaging with them. And that's why there's a 2% penetration rate. When you offer the board of an Islamic bank a commercially viable halal and tayyib, so permissible and wholesome product, they think it's too complicated and they don't do it. They like to reverse engineer conventional debt products. Management have no technical understanding of the product, Sharia compliant. They have no Islamic finance products of their own in their personal portfolios because they are not customers of the bank. They have no pre-existing deep networks in the Islamic finance industry, and they have no cultural affinity or trust within the Muslim community. They have no understanding of a holistic, sustainable, ethical economic model. They have a vague understanding of what it means to be Sharia compliant by reference to prohibitions. This is a lazy and ultimately harmful understanding of the Islamic economic model. And that's, by the way, because they also don't believe in Bitcoin. Again, I'm going to come to that. Anyone who says Sharia loses the right to discuss Islamic finance. Any of us, right? I'm tired of hearing old, middle-aged, non-Muslim men on so-called expert panels at conferences saying, I'm not a Muslim, but my understanding of Sharia is. Everything after I'm not a Muslim is bullshit. You don't need to listen to these people anymore. If a butcher shop was run by a guy with EDL tattoos with a Rottweiler at the front and he slaps a halal sticker on the front shop window, would you buy your meat from there? I don't think so, right? That's what we're doing with Islamic banks right now. The heart of the industry is being ripped out. There's a purge on the shop floor. All the passionate, knowledgeable, dynamic, motivated people, the ones who believe in and buy the product themselves, they've been pushed out through branch closures and redundancies. And by the way, let me be clear, I don't necessarily think the products themselves are not Sharia compliant. Personally, I take a view that it's better the devil you know. And even though Islamic banks operate within, I'm going to use that term again, fractional reserve banking system, and I'm going to explain to you what that means in a second, even though they operate within the same legislative and regulatory environment that conventional banks operate within, I still use them. Because as I say, I'd rather work with something that I feel some attempt has been made by some people to make it halal, right? Oh, by the way, one more author that's worth reading, Safdar Alam. If you want to know about the problem with Islamic banking, read Safdar Alam. Right, let's talk about fintech. I'm going to go through this very quickly because I think we're running a little bit short on time, right? We've got half an hour or 40 minutes remaining. I haven't even got the Bitcoin. Yeah. So about 4 or 5 years ago, I wrote a paper for Asian Treasury called Putting the City and the UK Economy Back on the Global Islamic Finance Map. I contended that the UK was losing ground to other locations, and I wanted London to re-establish itself as a centre for Islamic finance. So what I said was, let's promote Islamic fintech firms, because a lot of founders of Islamic fintech firms, you may have heard of names like Yielders and Nestor and Wahid and others. A lot of the founders are disillusioned with what they see from the Islamic banks. They had an economic problem that needed to be solved, a financial problem, and they weren't able to get product from the Islamic banks. So they founded their own companies. So young Muslims are reclaiming the narrative about the Islamic economy, and they're reclaiming it from the Islamic banks. They're creating their own jobs, and if Islamic banks don't recognize this, it's an existential threat to them. Fintech is something that I work on now. But what if there was an even more radical solution than a fintech company offering an alternative product to Islamic banks? What if you tore up the rule book and said, I'm not even going to try and bother replicating what the banks do? What if the financier became the servant and not the master? Because that's how it works right now with the banks. What if we had institutions that adhered to the principle of risk sharing and real economy financing, rooted in a hard or sound monetary system that can't create new money by the act of extending credit? Let's talk about the magic money tree. When the banks lend you money, what they're actually doing is creating new money. Fractional reserve banking works as follows. In the 16th century, a goldsmith would store people's gold. So you've got to, with your bag of gold, say, here's £5 worth of gold, you store it in your safe. The goldsmith gives you a receipt, he says, I owe you £5 worth of gold. And everybody is comfortable that their gold is stored there. After a while, these bits of paper are known to have value in the economy. They circulate because you know that this guy has stored £5 worth of gold at this very recognized and outstanding goldsmith. So that circulates as money in the economy. After a while, the goldsmith gets clever. He says, oh, hang on a minute. People are not coming to redeem their bags of gold with me. So what if I issued more pieces of paper than I actually had gold in my vaults? Now in the economy, you have pieces of paper circulating that are worth more than the actual amount of gold reserves sitting in the bank. The government legitimizes this and gives a license to the goldsmith. So you create the Bank of England. Now the bank is allowed to have a fractional reserve. In other words, the amount of gold sitting in the vaults is a fraction of the actual amount of money circulating in the economy. So the goldsmith, or now the Bank of England, can lend money out even though it doesn't have that money in the first place. This is nuts because it's a kind of like a legalized fraud. That's exactly what it is, right? That's how fractional reserve banking works. Every pound that you deposit in Lloyds or HSBC, they're lending out another 10 pounds. They've created £9 worth of new money. This is called money creation. So that's fractional reserve banking. What is another term that I'm going to define for you before we move on? What is QE? Quantitative easing. You may have heard of this, right? Colloquially, we call it money printing. You may have heard of that. It's not literally money printing. The government does not actually print money. What it does is the following. Right, it's a monetary policy. The central bank purchases financial instruments like government or corporate bonds from other financial companies like pension funds or insurance companies who hold these bonds as assets in their books in order to inject new money to those financial institutions. So the government or the central bank gives money to those financial institutions and says, I'll buy your bonds off you. And now new money has been created. This helps to lower the long-term interest rate and lowers the cost of borrowing for everybody. And that, of course, stimulates economic growth. That's the theory. Here's the practice. This new money is simply created from scratch on the central bank's own balance sheet. They simply increase the number value in their computer database. That's a kind of alchemy, really. And as I say, we colloquially call that money printing, because it's almost as if we are actually just printing brand new banknotes. We're just increasing the digits in a computer somewhere. And these new bank reserves are used to buy the financial instruments from the pension funds and banks who now have a lot of money. This money has come from nowhere. It's now sitting with the banks and the financial institutions. And they can now do something with it. They can circulate it within the economy. So they can hold it, they can lend it, they can buy other assets. So what happens is asset prices go up. Houses, cars, stocks, all sorts of financial instruments can go up. And lower interest rates are caused by the central bank's purchase of bonds, which means consumers, that's us, are now incentivized to borrow at these very low interest rates. So we fund new purchases. So there's a further increase in asset prices. The government tells us this is a good thing, right? And the people think this is a good thing, because apparently our houses and our pensions are now worth a lot more in pure dollar or pound terms. So we feel richer, and we re-elect that government. They made us feel richer by printing new money. What's actually happening in the economy is that the money we have in our pocket is now worth less because it's been diluted, because there's more of it circulating, right? Our wages don't rise as fast as asset prices because little people are not close to the money spigot. Spigot is a tap, the tap where money pours out from the central bank. The banks are close to the money spigot. The financial institutions, the rich, are close to the money spigot. They get to use it before everybody else. That's inflation. It's a reduction in purchasing power because the cost of goods and services and asset prices and commodities and houses and cars goes up. Because institutions are buying more and more of these things. The cost of wages stays depressed. So we lose our purchase power. And that leads to inflation. And that leads to poverty and misery and inequality. People are forced to borrow at the bottom of the chain to keep their head above water. And if this carries on, the rich who are close to the money spigot keep inflating asset prices into a bubble. And I believe this is what's happening exactly right now. So the wealthy are the least affected by inflation. They hold very little in fiat money. They hold a lot of their percentage of their net worth in assets. It's lower income workers who suffer from this because this is a form of regressive wealth tax. So you may have heard of Biden's promise that anyone earning below $400,000 will have no new taxes imposed on them, but he forgets to mention but actually we're now in double-digit inflation. So he's already stealing money from people by printing money. So I mentioned Saifuddin Amus's fiat business model. This was the neoclassical economics, which is that we find anything to sell, we borrow money from the Fed at 2%, we create a credit card for customers at 20%, and people are in debt for stupid things that they don't need, but it's okay because money loses value and GDP normally goes up. So this is the financialization of the economy that I was talking to you about. This model means that GDP goes up, but the inventiveness of society goes down. So I want you to look at periods of history when the inventiveness of society was very high. These are ages when gold was the single global reserve currency, right? And there's a reason why gold is a sound money. I'm going to come on to that. So you look at Rome at its height, Byzantium at its height, the Islamic Golden Age, the second half of the 19th century. Notice how trade was borderless and fluid during those times. Minimal tariffs, minimal restrictions. There were periods of political stability, scientific and creative and cultural progress. Look at the architecture of those periods. How many of those survive today, right? Humankind had time and space for higher pursuits. Now, every household has a minimum of 2 jobs and massive personal debt. We live to service our debt. And this is all because financial institutions are incentivized to lend us as much cheap money as possible because of money creation. But what if financial institutions were the servant and not the master? So I delivered a lecture in 2017 on the subject of Islamic finance, where one participant asked me what I thought of Bitcoin. And I said, I know very little about it. So I had to get him to explain it to me. And as he explained it to me, I said, whoa, it sounds like an even better version of gold. So I ended up believing that Bitcoin was the most Sharia-compliant form of money. And actually, now that I've been through the mill in Islamic finance and trying to correct the system from the inside, I realized it can't be corrected as long as you have fiat money within a fractional reserve banking system. The only way to correct it is by changing the monetary system to a sound money. If we can't use gold, because it's highly manipulated and it can be expropriated easily by a government, we need to find a money that cannot be censored, that cannot be seized from us, and that is sound and has all these other characteristics. I also think that there are other reasons why Bitcoin is a very Sharia-compliant form of money. I believe it encourages deferred gratification. Remember, I talked to you about this methodology of desertification. We choose projects that desertify the land, that ruin the land, that build towers in Makkah and destroy history, because you're incentivized to have exchange value, to put exchange value before experiential value. Well, I think that if there's a monetary base that encouraged us to have low time preference, so we save for our akhirah, we save for the future, we save for invest for our children, for our grandchildren, and for our hereafter, and that would lead to better economic decisions. I think that Bitcoin represents patience. And I think that we as Muslims are incentivized to act responsibly in this life and dutifully. We're stewards of our planet, and we care about our communities. We train our nafs in Ramadan, right? We discipline ourselves. We focus on spiritual health, on mental health, on physical well-being. One of our most valued qualities is sabr, patience. We believe our minds and our bodies are a gift from God, and we recognize that mindless consumerism and material values will not help us in this life. Sorry, apologies, will not help us in the next life. So we inherently, intuitively know that there's something wrong with GDP. Like, even if we are not, experts in economics, we know there's something wrong with that. We know that riba is a cancer. We know that curing riba can cure so many evils in our society. So what if there was a monetary system that was inherently anti-riba? Because you couldn't create money from thin air, which is the definition of riba. Yeah, it's working. So let's talk about sound money. Sound money is a medium of exchange. It's not a commodity to be traded. It's a store of value. It has its wealth. It's a unit of account. It's decentralized, meaning that no single party can manipulate it, for example, by printing more of it or quantitative easing. Nobody has control of it. It has saleability across time and space. It's accepted by society. Sound money leads to a free market, not a manipulated one. Historically, gold, that's the middle column, has been the soundest money. It's led to long periods of economic and political stability. The reason for that is it's got a lot of good characteristics. It's durable. It's not so portable. It's fungible, meaning one looks like another. One piece of gold is the same as another piece of gold, providing it has the same purity. It's verifiable to a degree. It's not easily divisible. It's scarce, very important, high stock to flow ratio. There's a lot of it in the ground, but it only comes out at 1% per annum. That's really important. You have to exert effort to get it out of the ground. That makes it scarce, which makes it useful as a medium of exchange. If something is not scarce, it's not very good as a medium of exchange, which explains why the US dollar has devalued by 96% in the last century. It has an established history, the best history of all. It's 5,000 years old, but it's been used as a currency for thousands of years. Censorship resistant, not so much. The US government expropriated private citizens' assets of gold in the early 20th century, so it can easily be censored. Bitcoin, on the other hand, is a form of money that is somewhat durable, very portable, because you can flash your phone on Lightning Network, and increasingly it's becoming possible to pay for a coffee or a pizza with it. It is fungible, meaning one Bitcoin looks like another. There are some issues, some small issues around that. It's very verifiable because it's based on a blockchain. What is a blockchain? A blockchain is a decentralized ledger, an account of all the transactions that have ever taken place. And when Muslims ask me, what do we really mean by blockchain? I give them the example of the Quran. Quran is a decentralized ledger. There's no one Quran that sits in a glass box in Makkah that we all refer to and say, this is the correct version. No, actually, we have maybe tens of millions of nodes around the world. What's a node? A node is a verifier. So imagine you're in the Taraweeh prayers and the Imam makes a mistake during the Taraweeh prayers in Ramadan. There's probably 3, 4, 5 people in the front row who are the Hafiz, the protectors of the Quran. They know it by heart, every punctuation mark, every vowel sound, every word. They know it by heart. These are the nodes who verify if one person makes a mistake. There's no one single copy of the Quran. It's spread across tens of millions of people throughout the world. That's what I mean by a censorship-resistant, decentralized ledger. That's what blockchain is. That's how I like to analogize it. Okay, divisible. Yes, it's very divisible. One Bitcoin is 100 million cents. Established history? No, it's only just been formed. It's 10 years old. Censorship resistant? Very, very important. Look at what's happening in Lebanon right now. The government has devalued the Lebanese pound by is about to devalue it by 93%. Citizens are about to lose 75% of their wealth. They're going to convert hard currency US dollar assets in banks to the Lebanese pound, and they're going to devalue by 93%. That's censorship. Censorship is being subject to the whims of other parties, and Bitcoin doesn't allow that. Fiat money, on the other hand, has none of these characteristics, right? Fiat money, the only thing that it's good for, frankly, is, well, I'm not even sure it's good for any of that. Usage. People use it. People use the dollar and the pound. That's what it's good for right now. But everything else it fails on. So we've found our scholars are extraordinarily poorly informed on this subject. And every now and then, you'll hear another fatwa from a scholar saying, oh, you know, wallahi, crypto is haram, akhi, and you know, this is the reason why. And they'll give you a whole lot of bogus FUD. You know what FUD means? Fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It's all propaganda. What they tell you, I'll give you an example actually. Egypt's Grand Mufti a few years ago, Sheikh Shawki Allah, he gave a fatwa against Bitcoin because the government had banned it. He said he claimed to have met quote unquote economic experts, but of course, you know, economic experts are government appointed orthodox neoliberal economists who are the priests of fiat, right? So they fear a medium of exchange that robs them of their raison d'etre, their right to exist. You know, the government wants control of the people, and it can exert that control through a centralized currency. The reason for his ban was illogical. He said it allows money laundering, fraud, and terrorism. And the other thing he said was it has no set rules. And therefore, it's a gharar, it's uncertainty, it's a void contract. This is nonsense. The reason why it's nonsense is because if I want to do money laundering, fraud, and terrorism, the best currency in the world is the US dollar. So you may as well ban the US dollar. The other thing is, no set rules. Well, that's the same as all fiat currency. In fact, the rules around fiat currency are even worse. Because if the government decides to devalue my currency by 93%, it can. And it did in Lebanon just now, right? Even the Bank of England says this on its own website, by the way. If you look at the Bank of England website, it says a shop is not required to accept your £10 note. They have the right to refuse. It's not backed by anything. The government, people say, oh, look on the banknote, it says, I owe you, or I owe the bearer of this £10. It doesn't owe you anything. It's backed by the threat of military violence. What do I mean by that? I mean that if Iran decided that it would not sell barrels of oil denominated in dollars, dollar, Bitcoin, or whatever, that the US government would go to war. That is the US dollar backed by the might of the US military machine. And that's why we talk about the military industrial complex. There are other, you know what, I'm not going to get into details on this because we're running out of time, but you can see lots of other social media scholars. You can see even respected Fiqh Council scholars like Sheikh Haitham al-Haddad, who gave a 16-minute diatribe about cryptocurrency, not understanding a single word of what he was saying about economic theory or modern finance. I mean, you know, there's a whole level of misunderstanding of his subject matter. I mean, if I needed brain surgery, I wouldn't go to a plumber. And if I wanted plumbing done in my house, I wouldn't go to a brain surgeon. I'd go to a specialist. So why are we devolving our thinking to scholars who don't understand anything about economics or modern financial instruments? If you're interested in the particular things that he said and my refutation of them, I've written a paper online. You can find it. It's called An Open Plea to the Scholars Who Have Declared Cryptocurrency Haram. By the way, I no longer talk about cryptocurrency. I only talk about Bitcoin. I'm going to come on to that as well. Okay, so skip that. Yeah. If we were to have a truly sound monetary system, we would have a free market because prices cannot be manipulated. And David Graeber once wrote that the local bazaar becomes the highest expression of human freedom and communal solidarity. Now, we have a very famous hadith actually narrated by Anas ibn Malik. It is that it's a very famous incident. The people said, Messenger of Allah, prices have shot up. So fix prices for us. Commodity prices were becoming high. People were worried that they couldn't afford basic commodities, bread, whatever. Thereupon, the Messenger of Allah ﷺ said, Allah is the one who fixes prices, who withholds, who gives lavishly and provides. And I hope that when I meet Allah, none of you will have any claim on me for an injustice regarding blood or property. That's an amazing, amazing hadith, because it's telling us that we should believe in free markets, because prices are controlled by the hand of Allah, not by us, right? For any of you who are thinking of going into politics, when you make policy about people's wealth, you open yourself up for potentially oppressing people, for them to consequently claim their rights against you on the day of judgment. It's a very serious undertaking. And I don't think politicians think about that at all. Let's talk about the scholars a little bit more. By the way, I work with a lot of scholars. Some of them are incredible human beings, amazing knowledge, very, very smart. I love spending time with them. They're very dynamic people. But in history, our ulama have failed us on new technology, right? And the example I use and always causes, so let me start with one example. In the 19th century, the Ottoman governor of Egypt, Mehmed Ali Pasha, introduced water faucets or taps into the Mehmed Ali Mosque in Cairo. And the ulama debated whether it was permissible to do wudu, the ablution before prayer, using taps. Can you believe that they were having this conversation, right? The only group of scholars who agreed that it was permissible were the Hanafis. So the taps were, for those of you who know Arabic, it's often called Hanafiya in different parts of the Arab world. Taps are known as Hanafiya. So I mean, I think it's an incredible debate. I get into trouble sometimes talking about the printing press because I often say, and it's a debatable point, that the printing press was banned on pain of death in the Ottoman Empire. This is the subject of some debate. Some people say that this is an Orientalist theory. One theory that I think is correct is the first printing press in Istanbul in the 18th century, I think it's 1727, aroused so much suspicion because it clashed with scholars' oral tradition of information dissemination, and therefore it was shut down. And I think this was a suicidal willingness to embrace ignorance. And I think it was a contributing factor in the decline of the Ottoman Empire. Ottoman scholars also debated telegraph wires, how far they could be sighted from the mosque, because they said it conveyed the voice of Shaitan, right? The Deobandis banned the loudspeaker at the turn of the 20th century. In the 1980s, South African ulama banned television, irrespective of content, even if you're watching the news. So now, of course, scholars are much more sophisticated, right? They're much more tech savvy, they're scientifically aware, right? I don't think they are. You're nodding, but I don't think they are. Based on what I've seen of their review of cryptocurrency and Bitcoin, I think they are so far removed from the subject that they are once again in danger of the people adopting a technology and then them catching up. That's what's going to happen. So, here's the question: is Bitcoin Sharia compliant? Well, as I said, it's like gold. It's inflation proof. It's decentralized. It's divisible. It's scarce. It's finite. It has a high stock to flow ratio. But it has other things as well. It has utility as a currency, which is improving all the time. It has anonymity. It has a speed of transfer, which is increasing all the time. It cannot be counterfeited through the blockchain. It's resistant to theft if it's properly stored. I don't want to talk about exchanges because that's a different issue. It's open source and it's durable. Fiat has only one of these characteristics, which is utility as a currency. So I think Bitcoin in particular is even better than gold. People say, oh, Bitcoin is not tangible, therefore it can't be Sharia compliant because money is meant to have tangibility in Islam. Where does it say that? It doesn't say that anywhere. I don't know why people say that. Bitcoin do exist as something real. They have form in the guise of digits. They can be accessed. They can be converted and exchanged. To simply negate the existence of Bitcoin is illogical. It makes no sense. So maybe today it doesn't have wide usage and social concurrence, but this is a transitory phase. We're still in an experimental phase in the first 10 years. It can't be printed from thin air. It's finitely bound by its algorithm, and it's secured by the blockchain. It cuts out the banking system. It needs to be mined. Proof of work needs to be mined or earned. You can't issue new Bitcoin against deposits. So you can't have a fractional reserve banking system, this legalized fraud that banks are today. So imagine hypothetically a world in which Bitcoin is the only currency. Since banks can't create it, they have to mine it or earn it. They can't issue new Bitcoin to borrowers. And potentially you have a deleveraged world economy because you cut out riba, right? It's anti-riba. It can't be manipulated by governments to devalue it. This seems to me a radical solution to wealth inequality, and it seems extremely Islamic, right? There's a total overlap between a Bitcoin monetary system and the Islamic economic model. It preserves wealth and harmony in society by reducing inequality and gives us time and space to focus on higher pursuits, like climate change, like the pandemic, like healthcare, like peace and stability. We don't go to war over stupid things, like oil, which can only be denominated in dollars. It has to be protected by the might of the US military machine. All of these things are cut out at one stroke. There's a very good journalist and commentator called Alex Gladstein. He writes for Bitcoin magazine. He wrote about, and I have a picture of Palestinians here. Bitcoin is a peaceful protest against a corrupt, exploitative, centralized financial system. So today, Lebanon and Gaza and other places are turning to Bitcoin. People in those locations are turning to Bitcoin to protect them, to protect themselves against hyperinflation, right? And external meddling, like the Lebanese government has just done to its citizens. The Gazans, for example, they have no central bank of their own. They have to rely on the Israeli shekel. And of course, they are penned in to their cages and unable to cross their checkpoints and earn the same wage that Israelis are earning over the border, even though they have the same currency. So there's no clearer demonstration of the dhulm, the oppression of fiat currency. So, I mean, as I say, I think Bitcoin is a protest against corruption and exploitation. Sanctions don't work when you don't control the money. I'm sure you're following this latest news story on the Canadian truckers. Again, whether or not you agree with their politics or not is irrelevant. The fact is, the Canadian government has frozen funds that were meant for the truckers and essentially categorized them as terrorists under emergency laws. This is a non-violent protest, which has now been designated an act of terrorism. And any funds that are going to those truckers, again, whether or not you agree with their politics is irrelevant. Those funds have been frozen. This is a form of oppression. If Bitcoin were the monetary base, it wouldn't be possible because governments cannot manipulate it. Another very good example is $10 billion of reserves, of US dollar reserves, held by the US Fed that belongs to the Afghani people. Biden has said the $7 billion that he holds in the US, half of it is going to give to 3,000 families, victims of 9/11, ignoring the millions of people that he bombed or his government bombed and killed and exploited for 20 years, who had nothing to do with 9/11. Now he's going to starve them out, right? That's what freedom looks like. That's what the modern notion of freedom looks like. Again, if you have Bitcoin as a monetary base, it's censorship resistant. It's a protest against exploitation and corruption. So, repressive fiat regimes create a society of debt slaves and dependency. Many of you are already falling into this trap because you have student loans and you don't have a choice over that, right? You got to get an education. So what do? You get a student loan, but you're already in dependency. You're dependent on financiers. And we're starting to discover collectively in this country, certainly, that governments don't work for us. They work for themselves and they work for their cronies. So the sooner we help ourselves by changing our economic system, the better. We might talk about central bank digital currencies later. I don't want to move on from that because I think we're running out of time. So let's talk quickly. Okay. I'm going to move on from this. We can talk about cryptos later. Very, very briefly, I used to talk about cryptocurrency, but I don't talk about it anymore because I think the only cryptocurrency that is truly decentralized and is censorship resistant and has a high stock to flow ratio and is considered a sound money is Bitcoin. All of the others are wannabes, and most of the others lack one or more of these key characteristics to make them sound money. I'm going to leave that for now. But the phrase that people use, and forgive me for the phrase, is Bitcoin or shitcoin. And I only deal with Bitcoin now. Okay, let's wrap up and we'll get a Q&A. Is Bitcoin the future for Islamic finance? Right. I'm going to go back to my 19-year-old self, listening to those bankers, the Islamic bankers at university, and listening to the lady from the Munabatun. That was an opportunity for them to explain why what they did would lead to a just economic system. If I have not done that today, please pull me up on it and ask me questions as to why I haven't explained it to you. As I say, the Islamic economy has been failed by the Islamic banks. Millennials and Gen Z are key to reforming that. I don't think the bankers are going to change. They lack diversity and vision. You know, they're the wrong demographic group, let's say, and you know, the FUD comes from them. The fear, uncertainty, and doubt is from people who believe in obsolescence. Einstein wrote 4 papers when he was 25 years old. Each of those papers was worthy of a Nobel Prize. He only won the Nobel Prize for one of those 4. But at the age of 25, he changed the world, right? That's the age at which you change the world. It's all happening for you right now. My time is over. Bear in mind, these are the best years of your life. Your mind is sharp, your body is sharp, your ideals are true, don't lose them. This is the time. What will happen in 10 years' time is you'll start to lose those ideals and you'll get jaded and you'll have a nice cushy job, hopefully. And you know, you'll just fall into that trap of saying, well, you know, that idealism is all very well, but you know, it's naive. It's not naive. People change the world in their 20s. So that's what you guys need to do. And I sincerely believe that Bitcoin is true Islamic economics. It's low time preference. It's investing for the akhirah. It's shunning mindless consumerism. It disciplines one's ego. It inculcates sabr. It encourages free markets. It condemns and corrects inequality. It's real economy. It's risk sharing. It has sanctity of property rights. Remember the Prophet's last sermon. It's free from state interference, and it feasts on corruption and manipulation. So that's where I'm going to lead it. I think it can reset the world's understanding of money. I think it's the most disruptive event in financial history, and it has, I believe, the power to fix the worst excesses of mankind. So thank you, and let's have some questions.
Harris, thanks for that very insightful talk. I think the book did until 8, so I think you can get through quite a few if everyone's willing to stick around. I think first in the audience.
Yes, I've got 2 questions. I can run to the top. First of all, what do you think about emerging fintechs like algebra? And second of all, how would lending work with Bitcoin? Like even if Bitcoin was largely adopted, how would lending work and loans work?
Brilliant questions. So the first question is emerging fintech. So I guess one of my roles today is I chair this Islamic Fintech, the UK Islamic Fintech panel. What we wanted to do was bring together all of the nascent and early stage Islamic Fintech firms. So we have, for example, the people behind Algebra as part of that panel, and many other firms that you've heard of, like Yields Investors and so on. And I think it's really, really important that young people who are disillusioned with the Islamic banking industry, because it hasn't addressed the financial problems that they have and tried to solve those problems, that people step forward and say, well, I think I can create this by myself. And they need to have the right people around them. That's why we created the panel, because we want to bring the right people to them. Make sure that we had access to people who were experts in finance, in the side of things, in accessing government. So, for example, we put the Bank of England and HM Treasury and the Department for International Trade and the City UK all on the panel, as well as observing members. And that was really important because it helped us to solve policy issues, help these companies to progress. So I'm not only a big fan of these companies, I'm a huge supporter of them. I think it's really important that we make it happen. But that's not to diminish the importance of the even more radical project, which is the Bitcoin project. So that comes on to your second question. How do you create finance? How do you create credit? Because credit's a good thing sometimes. It helps businesses to advance. It gives them the power to do things they wouldn't otherwise be able to do. But what if we had a system that was based on equity, not on debt? In other words, people would invest in a business and share potentially the profits and losses of it. Not just say, here's some money, give me a 5% interest rate, because that's not taking risk. That's not real economy, that's not risk sharing. Okay. So you could, in theory, and again, this is something that I'm looking at very closely right now, you could in theory have a financial institution that is not a bank in the traditional sense. So it doesn't have a license to print money. Let me rephrase that. It doesn't have a license to lend using a fractional reserve, right? So in other words, every 1 unit of currency that comes in, it can only invest that unit of currency, not 2 units of currency. It can't create an extra unit of currency, right? So that's how a Bitcoin bank, and I'm going to use the word bank very loosely, might work. It would also mean that any money that a Bitcoin institution invests must be an investment in its truest sense. In other words, it shares in the risks. So this is a very Islamic concept. Some people think that capitalism was born with early Islam, true capitalism. There's a book by Benedict Curler called Early Islam is Better Capitalism. And he contends that the systems of caravan trading that even Rasulullah conducted were purest early forms of capitalism. Because the financier, the Rab al-Mal, would give money to the Mudarib, the manager of money, who would then go out on a caravan journey with all these things to be traded and come back. And they would share according to a pre-proportioned ratio of profits and losses. That's pure risk sharing. That's how a modern, vibrant, risk sharing, real economy should work. So I think that's how a Bitcoin bank, financial institution would work. It would be real risk sharing and real economy. And that would be an amazing thing. So that's something that I'm trying to work on right now.
Just to remind everyone, we have a mentee in case you want to ask questions.
I thought I was sort of tight otherwise.
But if you want to interview on the brothers and sisters, WhatsApp chats.
Maybe on the corner was the next person to put a hand up. Yeah.
Sorry, I think that's the one of
Yeah.
but it's just with halal when it's specifically not
Yeah. So what I'm not going to do is I'm not going to make a statement, issue a fatwa on what it is and its impact. But what I will say is that Bitcoin seems to me the most Sharia compliant of all the potential cryptocurrencies out there. And my problem with the others is 90% of them seem like gambling. Now, maybe the XRP is a great technology. It has the ability to do other things. For example, people ask me about Ethereum as well. They say, well, you can build smart contracts around Ethereum. That's a really interesting technology. I'm quite interested in that. But as a currency itself, I'm very concerned when there's a cryptocurrency, as a medium of exchange, I'm very concerned when a cryptocurrency doesn't have proof of work, isn't fully decentralized, has a CEO and a development team who have the power to change things. Then I start getting worried. Then I say, well, actually, that's not so different from fiat currency. That's why I have a concern. So I won't declare anything halal or haram, but I'll just say Bitcoin's the only one that fits all the criteria.
So wasn't Bitcoin like that in the beginning? So wasn't Bitcoin exactly like that? Wasn't it like gambling as well in the beginning? So what makes Bitcoin different?
Because it now has the network effect. Because now you have, I don't know how many hundred million people have it. And with that network effect, it means that it's now survived every single attack of the blockchain in the last 11 years or whatever it is. And it's survived that. So yes, you could in theory introduce a brand new cryptocurrency that has even better characteristics than Bitcoin. Why would you need to? Because then that would have to resist all the attacks. And that would have to survive in a way that Bitcoin managed to survive. But it has social concurrence and it has some limited usage and it has powerful network effect and it's growing. So I would think, why reinvent? That's my.
Question?
Assalamu Alaikum. Thank you very much for the nice. A lot of the reasons why you said Bitcoin might be a positive thing seem to me to be because it will stop the sort of exploitative power of government. So the sanctions, whether it's being able to issue oil and their own currencies, surely all of these tools governments find really beneficial. Why would they ever legalize Bitcoin as a legal tender if it causes so much of a disadvantage to them? Even Muslim countries are also motivated by these, extra factors. Why would they? Yeah, I think it requires how that.
But what if you had 1 billion people using Bitcoin? You can't ban it. If you had 1 billion, you can't put 1 billion people in jail. Americans probably couldn't. You can't put 1 billion people in jail, right? How do you sanction against that? They can't do anything. They can't buy all the Bitcoin in the world and attack the blockchain and manipulate it in some way. So, the power is in the network effect, and whether governments like it or not, they can't censor it. So again, we get FUD every year or two. China says we ban something. India is saying it now. Lots of people are saying it. Go ahead, do your worst. I sincerely believe that they can't. And as much as they try to, once everybody's using it, it's like the ulama, right? Once everybody's using it, they just have to get on board. I think they're being very clever though. They're trying to manipulate public thinking so that they say to you, and I was going to discuss this and I didn't in the talk because we're running out of time, central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, right? So this is like Bitcoin, but not Bitcoin. It's basically fiat currency in a hyper-controlled surveillance state, right? So again, coming back to the Canadian truckers, they're unable to access their funds. Frozen accounts, GoFundMe is not allowed to give it to them. At first, they said they were going to repurpose it to other charities. My God, why would I give money to a platform that just gives my money wherever it feels like, right? That's censorship. But that's that's the beauty. That's how you prevent. CBDC is a way of ensuring of allowing digital currency that can be completely surveilled by the state. So if the state decides that you don't have a high enough social credit score, right, you're not a good enough citizen, you don't have the right group think that everybody has, we won't allow you to do certain things. Oh, you only had one vaccination, not two? You can't go to any cinemas or theaters or whatever. We ban you from buying those things. And we can do that now because we have a central bank digital currency. Everything you pay for is observed by us. So they're being very clever in jumping on the bandwagon and saying, hey, it's a digital currency, but actually it's the most fiat form of money possible.
I've got two questions. One thing, might just be my lack of understanding of it. One of the problems actually with Bitcoin is the volatility and the changing, I guess, when it's compared to the dollar. How would you be able to deal with that to make it something that people can actually use? And the second part of the question was to do with the carbon footprint of Bitcoin. To understand it's got quite a large environmental impact. And I wanted to
So volatility, we're 10 years into a 30-year experiment. There's a lot of turbulence in markets, turbulence in politics, and it's inevitable. So when you invest in a startup company, for example, you expect that stock price to be very volatile because it's an early stage company. So that's no different. We're at a higher risk stage right now. We're still very, very early. As it extends in 10 years' time, in 20 years' time, I personally believe that it will be a stable asset. But remember this, its price is measured against dollars, a fiat currency. So which is volatile, US dollar or Bitcoin? Personally, I think US dollar is the problem, not Bitcoin, right? It just so happens that we pay for goods and services in fiat money. That's why we think it's volatile. But if you took, a sheaf of wheat 2,000 years ago and priced it in grams or ounces of gold, you would find over the course of 2,000 years that the amount of gold you need to buy a sheaf of wheat is roughly the same. So that currency is stable. The same would not apply if you'd use the dollar. Again, using the example of the beginning of the 20th century to the end of the 20th century, it's devalued 96%. So that's the first question of volatility. It's natural at this early stage. I think it will iron itself out. The second question was regarding carbon footprint. This is a tricky one because anything useful requires energy. So if I said to you, you must cut out everything that uses energy in your life, you wouldn't have a washing machine. You would never use cars or transport or go anywhere or do anything or switch on your TV or switch on the light because it all uses electricity. So why don't we just ban all of those? Are they useful or are they not useful, right? Which of those represents mindless consumerism? We change our mobile phones every year or two in our contracts. Do we need to do that? And throw the mobile phones away and leak, metals into the ground. We're destroying the environment by our own mindless consumerism. And yet we have this argument that Bitcoin has got a huge carbon footprint. It's useful energy. Proof of work is useful energy. And I hear a lot of things about, it's destroying the planet. But if Bitcoin was a monetary system and it overtook fiat, you wouldn't need the banking system. You wouldn't need the US military industrial complex. You wouldn't need to defend the US dollar with the threat of military force. How much energy does the US military use every year? How much energy does the gold mining industry use every year? By the way, it's a lot more than Bitcoin. How much energy does the banking system use every year? By the way, it's a lot more than gold, which is a lot more than Bitcoin. So a lot of these arguments I hear about carbon footprint, I think are, and by the way, there's a lot of other arguments as well. So for example, Bitcoin miners relocate to areas where energy is cheap and readily available. Renewable energy sources in particular are a much higher proportion of Bitcoin miners than other industries. Similarly, you look at things like gas flaring. When you have oil rigs, they flare off gas to the environment. It's too expensive to transport. Gas naturally occurs where oil is, right? Oil reserves can be found. So what they do is they flare off the gas in the atmosphere. Miners relocate to those areas and use that wasted gas. That's just flared to the environment. It's being used rather than wasted, right? In El Salvador, they're using geothermal energy from their volcanoes. It's effectively free energy, right? So I'm hearing again a lot of fun about the carbon footprint of Bitcoin. Everything useful in life requires work, and work requires energy. And energy is good. Right? There's a question from this side. Lady at the back.
So,
Islam.
I actually have a few questions. The first one is about, like, I'm really interested in real estate investments, and I was wondering what are the Sharia-compliant ways to be able to invest in, like, buying land, like making buildings, etc., without having to pass by the conventional
Yeah.
banking sector.
Yeah.
The second question is how Bitcoin can be used in real estate investment in general,
Okay.
and also for somebody who's not really knowledgeable about.
I'm very
Bitcoin-
old, so my memory is very poor. So
Okay, so I'll wait for the.
you asked me that third question after I've answered these
Okay,
two,
okay.
right? So first one is real estate. Okay, so again, I use Islamic banks. I do use them because I believe in better the devil you know, right? And I've worked on these structures myself, so I tend to have some comfort with a contractual structure that says the financier buys the asset and then leases it to me, and I repurchase portions of the asset over time. So unlike a conventional bank that says, okay, here's a building, I'm going to lend you $1 million. You're going to pay me 5% interest rate. Every year you pay me 50,000. Okay, that's just a loan with interest. I will take security over the building. So if you default, I'll repossess. In theory, the Islamic bank is supposed to say, and it actually does something else. It's supposed to say, I will buy the building. I will take legal title to the building. Then I'll rent you the portion of the building that you don't own. Right? So let's say I put in 90% of the amount, you put in 10% of the amount, I will charge you rent on the 10%. And at the end of the period, 20 years or 10 years or whatever it is, you'll repay me the principal that I gave you originally. That's a halal transaction, in my view. That's a halal transaction. That's how it should work. So in theory, that's how the Islamic banks like to do their real estate financing. In practice, it's not always done like that. In practice, they often use this contractual structure I was talking about earlier, which is commodity murabaha, which I don't like very much because it's a synthetic loan. It looks like a loan, it talks like a loan, it quacks like a loan, right? It is a loan. So that was your first question, how it's done, how real estate is financed in an Islamic way. Second question was Bitcoin, can it be used for real estate? So right now, there are very limited uses for Bitcoin. There are secondary rails being established. In other words, we have this primary base layer, which is the blockchain, and very inefficient way of processing transactions. Deliberately inefficient, by the way, because it requires proof of work. Deliberately intended to be inefficient. So anyone who says, oh no, I'm not interested in Bitcoin, but blockchain, the technology is amazing, very efficient, it's great, they're wrong. It's not efficient, it's deliberately inefficient. It's meant to be that way, to secure it. Security requires that, because all of these nodes, remember the Hafiz who stands in the front row of the mosque during Tarawih? All of them need to know the whole thing by heart. That's an inefficient process, but it's an extremely secure process, right? So that means that you need to build secondary layers on top of the Bitcoin network. We have things like Lightning Network, which means that I can walk into a pizza place in El Salvador and, like Apple Pay or Samsung Pay, touch my phone against a point of sale system, and I can buy my pizza or my coffee in Bitcoin, or a fraction of a Bitcoin, right? Those are the secondary rails being established right now. We haven't got to the point yet where we can buy big assets, like real estate, with Bitcoin, but I believe that's not far away. You had another follow-up question?
Yes, I was wondering for someone who they just started thinking about like going to Bitcoin, what are your recommendations on like how to start getting into it?
Okay, so you mean reading material or?
No, more like I don't know, like investing and
Okay.
trading.
Yeah. So there's a lot of good stuff online actually that you can research. There is a scholar called Sheikh Muawiyah Tucker who has a hash. I think his handle is something like crypto hash, something like that on Twitter. He has a YouTube channel, really good basic tutorials on how to use Bitcoin. I'm a strong believer that I'm definitely not a crypto bro. Yeah, I have no interest in that. Remember that phrase I used earlier, which I won't repeat. But I'm not interested in non-Bitcoin crypto because I think that the vast majority of it is gambling. And so I'm not interested in what day traders say and what influencers say on TikTok and blah, blah, blah. That has no interest in me. I think of as a Bitcoin as currently a store of wealth that is graduating towards becoming a medium of exchange. So I'd like to find secure ways of buying and holding. obviously, if you leave your Bitcoin on it, you can open an account with any exchange like Coinbase or whatever. But bear in mind that if you leave Bitcoin on the exchange, it's not secure. It can be stolen, it can be hacked. So as soon as you've done the transaction, my strong recommendation is always to take it off the exchange and hold it in cold storage. What is cold storage? It's basically like a little flash drive. It's a hardware wallet that you can lock away or bury underground or do whatever you like with it. And the thing that protects your Bitcoin from being hacked or stolen is your seed phrase, your private keys. Nobody in the world needs to know your private keys, and nobody will ever know as long as you don't put it on an exchange. Don't hold it in a wallet on an exchange. You hold the keys, not the Bitcoin itself, the keys on a hardware wallet. And that's what ensures protection for you. And all of these things are really well explained by Sheikh Muawiyah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There's a question on the Mentee, the anonymous Q&A. Said you want to use Bitcoin as a medium of exchange, but what about what Bitcoin's proper focus is today, which is speculation? Is that Sharia compliant and halal?
So my first question is, who's speculating? Because I'm absolutely sure this is the most Sharia compliant form of money. That's a speculation. I have an ideological belief in this. I'm buying it, I'm holding it. Whatever I have spare at the end of the month, I don't want to have it sitting in worthless assets. Okay? So that's the way I treat it. So this idea that we're speculating, yeah, sure, if you're like a day trader, crypto bro, then yeah, you're speculating. You're buying Ripple and Cardano and Ethereum and da-da-da-da. Yeah, good luck to you. I have no interest in that. As far as Bitcoin is concerned, for me, it's an ideology. I don't know, does that answer? I don't know, tell me.
I'm not sure. If whoever asked that question maybe wants to.
Does anyone want to expand on that question?
Question
Before I ask another question, if anyone wants to expand on it, please ask.
Yes, after these.
So about Assalamu
Excellent.
Alaikum. I've got a few questions to ask. I think what the person asked was the speculation. It wasn't me, by the way. But I think speculation is in the sense that a lot of people buy it and then they speculate that it will go higher and they sell it, it will go back down. So is that something that is compliant with, or is it, do you buy it?
That's what we do with stocks, with our pensions, right? We put money into our pensions and they buy Apple stock and Microsoft stock. And is that speculation?
But the difference is one is investing into an actual company that produces a final product, whereas the other one is being advertised or in the future as a medium of exchange, as a source of money. So I guess the question would be, that's my first question would be that.
If you believe that only the US dollar was the only hard currency in the world, wouldn't it be incumbent on you to put all your wealth denominated in US dollars, right? Otherwise, you'd be throwing your money away. If you believe that that was the hardest form of money available, you'd say, well, that's the safest way to protect my future wealth, to protect my property, to protect the generations after, my children, my grandchildren, right? So I don't think that's speculation. I think that's a belief in something being a solid monetary base.
The second question would be, which what I wanted to originally ask is, how would it work? Let's say a country bans Bitcoin as a legal tender.
Yeah.
You mentioned that in a lot of places you can buy coffee with Bitcoin. If that is banned, and then so it's not used as a legal tender, and then also because now Bitcoin you mentioned is measured in US dollars. Now, does the US have the ability to ban the conversion of Bitcoin into US dollars? And therefore, you can't use it as a legal tender, and then you also can't convert it into dollars, which you can use in your everyday life.
So China's done this, right?
So what would the solution be?
Yeah, so China's done this, but they haven't managed to ban Bitcoin. And a country can try and ban it and prevent its citizens using it, and then watch the rest of the world take off. And as they see, Pakistan is a subject close to my heart because that's my heritage. And I look at the formation of Pakistan and what other countries did in that period. You look at South Korea or Singapore, how much they achieved in the same space of time, having started from the same economic base, right? They have accelerated way beyond. And we can find many examples of institutions, technologies, financial assets, countries who all started from the same base, but one accelerated the other. And the other eventually decided, oh geez, you know what, we missed a trick there, we should have done it. That's what I think will happen with Bitcoin. I think the countries will ban it, they'll realize they no longer have a rebellious population on their hands. You know, people, this is what happened in 5th century BC. You know, the governor of Judea wiped the slate clean and instituted the law of Jubilee and sent debt peons back to their families because he knew there'd be a rebellion because there were more slaves than everybody else. All right. So if you want to create a country of slaves, eventually they'll rebel against you. And I think that's what will happen if you ban Bitcoin. I'm committed to that idea.
Shouldn't people just move to El Salvador?
Yeah, that's what people are doing right now, believe it or not. Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. Before we go on to that, John, can you just repeat the book recommendations you gave?
Yeah. Okay, so Sefer Dinamus, the Bitcoin Standard. Debt the First 5,000 Years, David Graeber. Talking to my daughter about the economy, Yanis Varoufakis. My book. What else did I say? Safdar Alam. He's got textbooks and stuff, but you don't want to read that. You want to read what he says on Twitter. Alex Gladstein, journalist, Bitcoin Magazine. Alan Farrington, who's written a book called Bitcoin is Venice. He's big into Islamic finance, by the way. Those are the books that I can remember off the top of my head. And then general books about the failure of the economy during the financial crisis. Look at The Big Short by Michael Lewis. That's actually a good layman's book on the subject. A question over there?
You mentioned the white savior complex that a lot of Islamic banks.
I noticed you nodding when I said that.
You mentioned specifically the Gulf shareholders. I agree, from the Gulf myself, and I've noticed it firsthand. How do you recommend that us as young Muslims, especially those Muslim women potentially who are like thinking of going into Islamic finance or Islamic banking or whatever, how do you get into it? Because you mentioned the Islamophobic environment that people are facing. You mentioned the various different obstacles that you face, and the fact that people who are able to make that change in their 20s and in their prime are assigned like IT consultants and those kind of minor roles.
Yeah.
So realistically, how
Not
can
that
we
IT
get
consultant is a minor role, it's a very noble profession, but I know what you're saying.
yeah, just like how do we make a change and make an impact in that field when it's so hard to get into?
I mean, that's a really hard question. I don't even know how to begin to answer it. But what I'm seeing right now is I see a lot of young people who've got really interesting ideas and are trying to found their own companies. Before they do that, I think they need a little bit of like real world experience as a blue chip company and as a conventional environment. When I first got into conventional banking, because I started as a project financier, that was financing roads and railways and so on. I actually asked a famous name in the Islamic finance market, look, I've been given this offer. I'm really uncomfortable because I don't want to work it. He says, you have to do it because if you don't learn the skills, you can't help anyone. You have to learn the skills first. Keep your intention pure. People ask me, should I work in the conventional finance industry? And I say, look, it's not my conscience, it's yours. You have to decide whether the end justifies the means. For me, it did. But I would not say that to anyone else because then the sin potentially falls on me, right? So it may be the right route. I'm not saying this is the only route. The right route is to get a standard graduate job in finance, learn the skills. And then once you have the necessary skills, the necessary network, to try and gather the right people around you. Gather good people with complementary skill sets. You can start to think about founding your own company. I think that's really where the future lies. And I keep saying it, because people in their mid-20s are really at the peak of their thinking ability. If not quite their experience, that will take another 5-10 years. But that's the point at which they really start to make waves. And I think the right way is to think about becoming an entrepreneur, get your skill base, and then found your own Islamic fintech company. And maybe by then, Bitcoin becomes a well-used monetary base. So I hope that's some kind of answer.
Okay, that's all.
Okay.
Thank you everyone for coming.